are these people?
From Russia with Love. Those of you might know that's a James Bond movie, Sean Connery era. So I've seen mainstream media talk about this summit a little bit, but this is just a lesson that if you are, I think especially for us doing this, and for you at home, if you're reading stuff, in a paper or what you see online, it's always good to read more than one source.
Yeah.
Just as a good reminder of that, because I think especially with mainstream media, they're gonna say things in one way in a bias that fits their narrative, and then you're gonna have another place that's gonna say it from another perspective. So what do I mean by that? So I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So
those Russians.
So I'm going to first read this article from CBS News, written by Debora Patta, where she reports Russia-Africa summit hosted by Putin draws small crowd, reflecting Africa's changing mood on Moscow. So she reports, if Vladimir Putin was hoping for a big show of support at his Russia-Africa summit, which kicked off last Thursday in St. Petersburg, he has once again been caught on the back foot by his own overweening confidence. Just 17 African heads of state, according to Russia's own tally, showed up for the summit. That's less than half of the 43 leaders who participated in the first Russia-African summit in 2019.
Pause. Why are they already, like, Putin's on the back foot? Right, like, I have read multiple things about this from other publications. None of them thought Putin was on the back foot in any of them.
Right.
Like,
so but you kind of hit the point already, but you already see the spin on this, like kind of minimizing, there's just 17 African heads there. Putin, but it basically makes Putin look like shit.
Yeah.
Essentially. So already the spin is in. So this is why, so it's long because I'm going to read this from two sources just to give a more balanced idea of what happened at the summit, and we're going to see if they mention anything that was discussed in the summit. You can probably guess the answer to that. But regardless, that's less than half of the 43 leaders who participated in the first Russia-Africa summit in 2019. The list of notable absences included the leaders of several large African nations.
Yeah, the ones we control.
Including including Nigeria's Bola Tinubu and Kenya's William Ruto, as well as Felix Tshisekedi of the Congo, of Rwanda's Paul Kagame. So yes, basically the ones that are
we got hands on.
Yeah, basically yes.
Yeah.
Africa, a continent of 45 nations and 1.3 billion people, has a complicated relationship with the Western world. Africa is 54 nations. It's true that Africa harbors lingering suspicions towards former colonizers in Europe and in the UK, and the US African leaders often accuse their Western counterparts of hypocrisy and acting purely in their own selfish interest, of only paying attention to the challenges on this continent when they need to. But any sense that the continent as a whole is leaning towards Russia is mistaken.
You sure? Are you sure about that? Like,
as Putin has become increasingly isolated by sanctions imposed over his war in Ukraine, the Russian leader has tried to use the West's colonial past and its perceived condescension towards Africa to woo the continent. Many African countries share Putin's contempt for US and European economic sanctions, and they've even called on the West to lower its financial weaponry aimed at Moscow. But Russia's decision last week to pull out of an agreement with Ukraine to enable the export of grain and to then bomb Ukrainian ports destroying thousands of tons of food, enraged countries like Kenya, which lambasted the decision in no uncertain terms as a stab in the back.
Are you sure about that?
Putin has miscalculated the mood on this continent, South African professor William Gamede of Wits University School of Governments told CBS News. Gamede said Putin's decision to pull out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative had strained Russian relationships with countries where food security is often a matter of life and death. The agreement was brokered by the United Nations and Turkey last year to allow the safe passage of agricultural goods from Ukraine's ports through the Black Sea, a region squarely in the crosshairs of Russia's invasion. While the vast majority of the nearly 33 million tons of grain exported since the deal was reached a year ago never actually reached the world's poorest countries, the deal did help bring down reverse spiraling food prices by more than 20%, according to the UN. Even if countries can afford to buy grain, Russia's decision has a massive impact on inflation, some Gamede. Speaking at the summit on Thursday, Putin said Russia was ready to supply 6 African countries with between 25,000 and 50,000 tons of grain free of charge. We will also provide free delivery of these products to consumers, he said. Putin again accused Western countries of obstructing the supply of Russian grain and fertilizers, repeating his government's longstanding complaint that the U.S. and its allies weren't keeping up their end of the bargain under the grain deal, while hypocritically accusing us of the current crisis situation in the global food market.
That's because it's you.
Gamede dismissed Putin's remarks as a cynical announcement and told CBS News it was, at best, only made to stem rising criticism of Russia's withdrawal from the grain deal by African leaders.
So he thinks it was to make people upset with him? That's what he thinks? You fucking idiot. Why would anyone do that? What? Who thinks I should fuck myself over? No one thinks that. What the fuck? Like,
so if you can zoom out for a second.
Yeah.
So obviously you could see the spin already. All right.
Yep.
So friend of the show, who actually is in Moscow, Fiorella Isabel, she tweeted out, because she's been following this. She says, Western media headlines on the Russian-Africa summit say it was a failure. Meanwhile, delegations from 49 out of 55 countries in Africa show up.
Yep.
So very different from the, how many, 17? CBS News said.
Mm-hmm.
Russia will give free grain to African nations in need within months. Didn't mention that whole thing. African leaders remind Putin of their historic relationship going back to the Soviet Union, with Roman Lumumba, director of the Patrice Emery Lumumba Foundation, saying Russia treats Africa as equals. BRICS nations expand on de-dollarization. We've talked about that here. African leaders ask Russia for aid in ousting foreign intervention, one being Libya. Summit ends with adoption of a 74-point document outlining the key areas of cooperation with Moscow, from trade and security to nuclear energy and climate change. Additionally, Vladimir Putin announced a 12.2 billion ruble,
1.2 billion ruble,
around $13 million investment in African healthcare systems, and pledged between 25,000 to 50,000 tons of grain for Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea.
Please, Faye, come on.
So just wanted to show you this real quick. I just pulled this out real fast. These were headlines from articles that I found that, that basically say Africa shun Putin. Putin says African initiative could be basis for peace in Ukraine. Russian Africa summit, Putin offers unconvincing giveaways in a desperate bid to make up for killing the Ukraine grain deal. U.S. takes aim at Kremlin over Russia Africa summit. No meaningful commitments.
BigMadCrab in the chat said the entire grain deal is because Ukraine blew up Crimea. This is because of the bridge. All Putin did was, oh, you're gonna fuck up my infrastructure on the day of grain deal renewal? Fuck you then.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Oh, so yeah. So this was our version of the summit. Now let's go to another article written from RT. We don't use them a lot, but I think given the context, I think it makes sense. Since this took place in Russia, we should hear the Russian perspective.
Our friends, the Russians.
Right? So, so they say, this is written by the editorial board, I believe. US and UK media pour scorn on Russia-Africa summit. Coverage of the St. Petersburg meeting appeared to follow cherry-picking talking points. So they just basically go right in.
Yeah.
British and American outlets have embraced...
Hold on. I gotta fix it. There we go.
Okay, thank you. British and American outlets have embraced a set of similar talking points in their coverage of the Russia-Africa summit taking place last week in St. Petersburg, focusing on the number of presidents in attendance, blaming Moscow for the demise of the Black Sea grain deal, and bringing up the presence of Wagner on the continent. A total of 49 African countries sent officials to the two-day summit, which ended with a 74-point joint declaration pledging cooperation with developing a multipolar world order. Western outlets, however, chose to focus on the number of presidents in attendance, and a quote by Kenyan diplomat Corey Singh Olei, who tweeted last week that calling off the grain deal was a stab on the back at global food security prices.
Joint declarations are the best kind of declarations, but I digress.
Russia decided not to extend the year-long arrangement that allowed Ukraine to export 33 million tons of grain, mainly to the EU, Turkey, and China, with only a tiny amount reaching Africa, because the UN never enabled the export of Russian grain and fertilizer, which were blocked by Western shipping sanctions.
Yep.
Kremlin seethes over poor summit turnout, CNN declared in a headline, echoing the just 17 talking point. There was nothing to corroborate the claiming of seething. However, only another assertion further down that the Kremlin fumed over the poor turnout when referring to Western pressure on the continent's leaders. And the idea that Africa as a whole leans towards Russia is clearly mistaken, argued Washington Post columnist Adam Taylor, using votes in the UN General Assembly as its metric. Taylor also brought up less than half of 43, the grain deal, and Singh Olei, I guess that's how you say it, sorry. Newsweek also echoes the 1743 difference, though it noted that 32 more countries were represented by officials or ambassadors. So,
yep.
I mean, what's the difference?
Uh-huh.
Again, so just our way of kind of downplaying, like presidents or leaders of African countries,
right? Like if we sent the chief of staff or the secretary of state, that would be us showing up, you know. So
their headline, however, focused on mockery of President Vladimir Putin's handshake with the Ethiopian Prime Minister by the Polish-based Telegram channel Nexta, which promotes Ukrainian narratives and regime change in Belarus.
Putin's a madman.
Time had a more ambitious headline, Why African Leaders Are Staying Away from Putin's Russian-Africa Summit, but instead of delivering on the clam, provided the same talking points. Grain deal, Singh Olei, Wagner.
I think that means claim. RT, you put clam, you know? It's their fault.
Boisted by quotes from Western think tanks. Putin left red-faced as few African leaders turn up to his Russia summit, claimed HuffPo, a surviving subsidiary of BuzzFeed. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, they've just really...
Oh yeah, they went bankrupt. They're not a thing anymore. HuffPo still lives. So...
They too went with the 1743, the grain deal and a quote by Singh, Olehi, and Wagner, but also chose to highlight that 49 African leaders showed up at U.S. President Joe Biden's summit last December. HuffPo also attributed the phrase, "It seemed the novelty has worn off," to the Russian outlet Kommersant, though it was in fact a bit of editorializing from a tweet by BBC correspondent Steve Rosenberg. The British press also checked off the talking points. 17, grain deal, stab in the back, Wagner, Kremlin banks threats for some other leaders due to
the walls are closing in. Yep.
Proclaim the Guardian, also bringing up Biden's December summit as a comparison.
Which I'm betting they counted every ambassador and whatever for that, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Fresh humiliation for Putin as he faces poor turnout by African leaders was the Daily Mail's headline of choice, even as they admitted 32 more countries were represented at some level. Right. So, tweet from Going Underground, they say, birth of a multipolar world, the Russia-African summit begins today in St. Petersburg. Of course, this was last week. Despite enormous pressure from the US and EU on African countries to not attend, so that wasn't mentioned in any of the Western press. That they were discouraging African nations not to go. 49 out of 54 African countries are attending the conference. Today, Africa is asserting itself more confidently as one of the poles of the emerging multipolar world. Putin.
Putin. I like that. I like that text logo under there. That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Or you can barely read Russia. You should have got rid of that white. And I guess it's Russian flag though, you know?
It's a Russian flag. Yeah, but that blue is not their shade of blue though.
This side works. Like this side, it's hard to read that R. Just saying, whoever did the graphics on that, you could have I don't know, put an outline or something, would have helped. Literally, I think just an outline on that would have made it. Anyway, sorry, I get distracted.
No, you got squirrel moment, but
yeah.
But I mean, so I wanted to do that just as a reminder to our folks at home. It's important, and again, you learn this in school. If you use one source, use another. Ideally, try and get sources from the people that it affects.
Yep.
I don't think we necessarily do a good job of that, and I think especially it's a lot harder to get news articles, international ones at least, are a little more, less biased. But I think it's good practice anyway, and we try and do that here. We probably should do more of that, honestly, but But if anything, we try and use more independent sources besides the mainstream ones. But as I said, always good to try and get the perspective of the people who are there, just to give a more balanced.
So you brought
view.
Al-Jazerra, right?
I did also bring Al-Jazerra. Again, I just want to cover all bases.
All your bases belong to us.
Right. So, but this goes into a little more specifics in terms of what was spoken at the summit, which neither one or RT or even that CBS article mentioned, really. So RT did a little bit. This goes in a little bit more depth. So that's why I wanted to pull this as well. So Putin promises grains debt write-off as Russia seeks Africa allies. Putin pledges to supply Africa with grain, promotes joint fight against neocolonialism during Russia-Africa summit.
Okay.
Oops, wait.
There you go.
There we go. Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country and the African leaders attended a summit in St. Petersburg have agreed to promote a multipolar world order and fight neocolonialism as he offered death write-offs and grain to allies. Notice how they didn't say wanted to fight neocolonialism in the West. Gee, I wonder why. Russia's attention to Africa is steadily growing, Putin said on Friday at the end of the two-day summit. The meeting was seen as a test of Moscow's support in Africa, where Russia retains backing despite international isolation sparked by its war in Ukraine. Last Thursday, the Russian leader promised free grain to 6 African nations and assured them that Moscow was trying to avert a global food crisis nearly a week after withdrawing from an agreement that allowed Ukraine, one of the world's largest grain producers, to export its farm products across the Black Sea. The Russian leader also mentioned the joint determination to counter neocolonialism, the practice of applying legitimate sanctions, and attempts to undermine traditional moral values. Representatives of 49 countries, including 17 heads of state, attended the summit in the Russian city. Participants signed a joint declaration that called for the establishment of a more just, balanced, and stable multipolar world order, firmly opposing all types of international confrontation in the African continent. Al-Jazerra's Ali Shahim, reporting from St. Petersburg, said the declaration is Russia's new initiative towards Africa. There is a Russian plan for Africa, he said, adding that there are very ambitious initiatives from Putin. Russia wants to gain Africa allies. This is why it's initiating more and more towards Africa, to the extent that President Putin wants to revive the social era investments in Africa, he said. And actually, Reef actually showed me a cartoon a couple of weeks ago. It was done in the 60s, I believe, that kind of in its way kind of speaks into this, or at least kind of speaks from
anti-capitalist African sentiment from Russian cartoonists. You know,
we should probably do a reaction to that, actually.
Yeah, we should do that.
A good segment. But yeah, but I digress. According to Hashim, Russia plans on building plants and factories and increasing diplomatic missions on the continent. Putin is also promising to maintain grain supplies to Africa after he withdrew from the Black Sea grain deal. He is blaming the West for higher food prices and inflation and said the global economic system is going through significant change. Africa is the new center of power. Its political and economic role is growing exponentially. Everyone will have to take this reality into account, he said. For several years, the Kremlin has openly engaged in diplomatic and economic offenses on the continent and offered security services in the form of the Wagner mercenary army to African governments fending off armed groups. But in recent months, Russia has had to step up its quest for alternatives to European partners. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, what's that?
Sergei Lavrov.
Has toured Africa twice since January, seek to draw it into Moscow's camp and presenting Russia as a bulwark against Western imperialism and neocolonialism. African leaders pressed Putin to move ahead with their peace plan to end the Ukraine conflict. Didn't hear that in Western press either.
No.
While not directly critical of Russia, their interventions on the second day of the summit were more concerted and forceful than those that African countries have voiced previously. They served as reminders of the depth of African concern at the consequences of the war, especially rising food prices. This war must end, and it can only end on the basis of justice and reason, African Communion Commission Chairman Musa Faki Mahamat told Putin and African leaders at the summit. That was easy to read, and I couldn't read it. The disruptions of energy and grain supplies must end immediately. The grain deal must be extended for the benefit of all the peoples of the world, Africans in particular. Republic of the Congo President Denis Sassou Nguesso said the African initiative deserves the closest attention, as he called urgency for peace. Senegalese President Macky Sall saw a de-escalation to help create calm, while South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said he hoped that constructive engagement and negotiation could help end the conflict. The summit took place in the wake of the Russian withdrawal from the grain deal. The suspension of the deal, which had helped to stabilize global food prices and avert shortages, increased fears of a global food crisis. Putin reiterated that Russia would continue to supply African friends with grain crops both on a contractual basis and free of charge. Putin added the leaders had agreed to improve cooperation on aid, energy, and trade, including by consistently switching to national currencies for commercial transactions. The Russian leader also pledged to wipe out the debts of Africa. Many of the leaders had warm words for Moscow's record of support for their countries in their 20th century liberation struggles, and the final declaration promised Russia would help them seek compensation for the damage done by colonial rule and secure the restoration of plundered cultural treasures. The leaders of Mali and the Central African Republic, whose governments have relied heavily on the services of Russia's Wagner Group, both expressed gratitude to Putin. President Faustin Archange Tudera said Central African Republic's relations with Russia had helped save its democracy and avoid a civil war. He thanked Russia for helping us to impose foreign hegemony.
So, well, sounds like Russia ain't doing as bad in Africa as we would like of us to believe.
Right. And as I said, I felt it was very important to read different sources. So obviously it made it for slightly longer, actually not that long of a segment, but I think it's just important because this is, and talking with people online, especially with this deal with Russia, Ukraine, it's very easy to see why people are just kind of fixated on our stance in Ukraine. And again, we say this all the time. It's not to say Putin is a good guy, you know, like there's that thing called nuance that people have to understand, that people have to look on. Like, if you want us to have nuance in regards to Ukraine, then we should have nuance in terms of how we view Russia as well. So, and again, a lot of the stuff that was written in Al-Jazerra, we weren't hearing, you know, and of course they're not going to hear it because it doesn't benefit the West. That Africa, many African countries are now shifting their focus to Russia, given that Russia is actually giving them stuff in support, you know, kind of similar to China, what it's doing.
Yeah. Well, and military aid and, like, you know, classic. Well, it's essentially what we've been trying to do for years. You know, they're just actually doing it better. They're not leaving a ton of bases and a ton of military and a ton of, like, they're not doing that. So, you know, we've extended our empire to, I think it was, who was it in the chat? U.S. refuses, go start. U.S. refuses to withdraw 1,100 troops from Niger. Right? Like, we're just leaving them there. You know? So, that doesn't make, like, that would make me, you know, if a foreign entity's military was just hanging out in my backyard, I'd be a little tentative, you know?
Right.
And you see Niger and Nigeria are all button heads, and you see in, you know, essentially the ones we control are now trying to, you know, throw stones. Like, so, you know, we'll see. But I saw recently that work's going to start on a inter-African, like, highway system. Like, which that's going to be a big deal. Like, and especially if the Russians and Chinese are willing to help with that infrastructure building, that's going to be a problem for us. Like, you know, it means we might not get the resources we've been stealing forever. Like, so it might go to elsewhere in Africa. Right.
So there are two things that I want to talk about before we kind of end this segment. The first thing is, I'm kind of concerned about what this many of these countries in Africa, and now working somewhat in solidarity with Russia and China. Well, China's been a thing, but now Russia. It does concern me how the West is going to retaliate, especially given that, again, Putin has promised food, Putin has promised rebuilding, the health infrastructure in many countries. I'm sure there might be more on the pipeline that, wasn't necessarily mentioned here or will be discussed in the future. It just concerns, especially given that we have all these military bases on the continent, that it does concern me especially with Ukraine. Like, it just gives me more place to worry in terms of ramping up more of a civil war among countries in a way, or if not an outright world war where Africa will almost kind of be in the middle of the fight,
Yeah.
So that's kind of my concern right now. I can argue that many of these countries are looking to Russia and China essentially for protection because they have the nukes, So, but my concern is obviously that working class people, normal people are going to be affected, in whatever conflict that might arise out of this, especially given some of the African countries that are basically establishment dogs for the West. So that's first concern. Second concern, and I've said this on the show many times, is it good for Putin to supply tangible needs? Sure. You can make that. Yeah. Would I prefer that?
There was a leader recently. I saw a video that talked about literally saying what you're about to say now, of like, this is like, I think he made the claim of like, it was a lot of African leaders travel the world to beg, right? Like that sort of thing, where it's like, we shouldn't be doing that. We should be making our own, way in the world. Like, so, that sentiment is out there.
That's basically what I wanted to say. Those of you who have watched the show for a while, and I probably should have him on again at some point. My one of my mentors in Rwanda, Ronnie, he mentioned this. In terms of Africans are not looking for handouts. Like Africans want the option, preferably, as we say, seize the means of production. They need help in developing the infrastructure so that they're able to do it on their own.
Which if those roads are gonna fucking be built, man, prep for a bumpy ride here, because the fucking the
Russians don't take a dump, son, without a plan.
I mean, they got moves. They're making money moves over there right now. So,
my hope is, I think, considering the circumstances, it's a good thing for Putin to supply aid in this way. However, I would also hope that a lot of African countries refer to back in the days of the Soviet Union when they were more communist, the relationship with Russia at that time. Putin is not that guy per se. He is not. Well, Reef and I can make probably more socialist than many of our leaders here for sure, but he still kind of works within a capitalistic mindset, I would argue. But I hope that this can be the catalyst for African nations to develop their own infrastructure so that they don't need to be dependent on Russia. They don't need to be dependent on China. They don't need to be dependent on the West to supply them with really, at this point, basic needs. So the idea right now, the infrastructure is just not there on the continent right now. And, so yeah, I agree. It's the idea of like, I don't want to see Africans be seen as the beggars or the continent where we have to help these poor people. Like, I don't want to have that mindset. And I think that mindset is still kind of perpetuated, definitely in the West. I don't want that mindset to be perpetuated, Russia, given that ideological system now. If this were back many years ago, that would be one thing. So I hope that Putin or whoever is able to kind of bring them up into that
Well,
socialist mindset, communist mindset of
if
being
we've,
able to supply for their own needs, so Africa can be a powerhouse in of its own right.
if
You
we've
know
got
what
time,
Libya could have been before we essentially fucked them over.
yeah.
So
If we've got time at the end of the show, I might tell Fanto to have another 5th clip of that cartoon. We might react to that at the end of the stream. So, well, it's only 15 minutes. I think if we get through the rest of these pretty quick, you know, we can get to it. I also found another one if we want to do that. That's about Africa from the 30s. So we'll see how that one goes.
I think the one you showed me, I think is more relevant to this. So I think we could probably try and do that. If not tonight, then maybe in the extra segment that we can show.
Whatever.
But I think either way, I think, I think honestly, like, just to kind of get that, I think it's good for you guys, to see it. So
shout out to Kit in the chat saying hit the like button, reminding you to do so.